Hey folks, just wanted to give you a bit of a briefing about the budget. Generally, the budget story lasts about 3 or 4 days, mainly because most of us just sort of get on with living our lives, and that's about it, really. Um, there are some changes in the budget that you see come through. One of them is the tax cuts. As you may have been following, I think the really important part of the budget is what all of us do with our tax cuts. Those who get extra money will either spend it, which will add to economic growth because people are spending more. If they don't and they choose to get the 50 or 60 or however many dollars they get per week and put it into their mortgage account or their mortgage offset, that is not going to add to economic growth. And so, therefore, the economy won't really get much of a boost from that. Um, the two big themes are basically inflation and the cost of living. Inflation's a bit of a tricky one. You'd have to be blind Freddy not to see that the prices haven't gone up. However, there's the flip side of that is that people who have got savings, and if you go back, 5, even probably a little bit longer, 10 years ago, you'll hear a lot of complaints from old people like me that we've got the cash and we're getting like 0.5%. That's really terrible. I've got to go and buy lots of stocks because I need to get a yield. Now, people like me can get 5 or 5.5%. That actually makes it a lot better. So, on the one hand, I can complain to you about petrol being $2 a litre in Brisbane, or Doritos corn chips, gone from $2.50 to $4.50. But the other flip side of that is if you have a decent amount of cash put away, then you're generating 5%. So, for example, if you have a think about it this way, if you had, and I'm not saying it applies to everybody, of course, but if you had $2 million that was earning 5%, you're generating around 100,000 a year. Now, if your cost of living is 70,000 and inflation is running at 5% or even 10%, then your budget will go, your costs will go from 70, let's say round it up to 80,000. The fact is you're now getting 100,000. And so that's why you're seeing quite a lot of baby boomers actually rejoicing because they're now being able to get more money for their cash and they're spending it. So that's one part of it. Inflation also eats away at debt. So those of you who have a mortgage or an investment property should be sort of partially all right with inflation because it'll eat away at your debt. Many years ago, 50 years ago, the idea of inflation was that it was good for those who had debt and not that good for those who had cash. So at this stage, if you've got a lot of cash, well, at least you're getting some sort of money. What that means also is, oh, well, if I'm getting, let's say I've got 2 million, I'm getting 100,000 a year. Okay, well, I don't really need to rush into the stock market or the property market if my cost of living is covered. And that's what's going on for a lot of people. Well, a lot of the older people, I should say. Um, okay, the other one is the cost of living, which is connected directly to inflation. Wages are rising, but they're not rising, a lot. So from that perspective, the inflation will still be biting people predominantly at the lower end. Those people will tend to spend the extra money they get in tax cuts. So that may help the economy, but that may be counterbalanced, as I said previously, by wealthier people who say, well, I'll just let the money pile up. Other aspects of the budget, one that I think is really important, there's two important parts here. One is the federal government is in a surplus of $9 billion. Dollars. Now, the economy in 2 minutes is basically if the government spends more money, that money is going into the Australian economy. So, in other words, they're saying we're going to build a road and we're going to employ all these people. Now, all those people who get employed think that the government spending money is a pretty good idea. So, that generally feeds into the economy. So the government this year said we've achieved a $9 billion surplus. So what that means is they've got $9 billion more than what they spent. Now, if you're an Australian, you should be saying, well, listen, why don't you spend the money on something and put it back into the economy? The argument comes from this bizarre idea of a lot of economists thinking that the government is the same as a household, and it's not. As a household can't create its own currency, a government can. Australian dollars are created by the Australian dollar, the Australian government, and you may have heard Jacob, Tom, and I talking about this and saying the government can't run out of money. Now it can go absolutely crazy and cause inflation, but that's a pretty low not objective, but it's a pretty low aim at the moment, or a pretty low threat, because the budget is in surplus. Now, next year, which is an election year, the Albo and Chalmers have decided to up their game a little bit, and they're looking at a deficit of about 28 billion. Okay, now we're starting to see some money. That's about 1% of GDP, and that will make a substantial change in the economy. That money will flow through, and it will be in all types of programs and infrastructure. So that should help bolster economic growth. The political cynic in me says they're doing that because it's an election year, and you don't even have to be a cynic. Basically, that's what they're doing it for. It's the same reason Joe Biden's throwing the money around in the United States. Not too many people sort of take money from the government and go, gee, I'm really concerned about the government deficit. Most of us just grab it with two hands and spend it. So that's the idea. A couple of things for investors. It should keep the Australian market fairly sort of buoyant, or at least stable, without being spectacular, unless people go out and madly start borrowing again. Secondly, the issue in terms of the deficit, as I said, will push economic growth up.